Uh, well, this is a real treat, and I hope it will become less excruciating for Julia as time goes by. And maybe my paper might be a bit more less excruciating, because I don't think I talk about you quite so much, Julia, so that might be a bit more comfortable. Sorry, okay, one of the, it's quite interesting because although I feel I know Julia very well, and I have known Julia, like been in the same rooms and at the same conferences and things for many, many years. I've never done a project with Julia. We've never collaborated or something. I've never worked in the same institution. I don't think we ever shared funding or anything like that. I think I feel I know Julia through her published work more than anything else. And that's not so much different than knowing Julia, but I would say it's the best way to know Julia. It's through her writing, not that it's or whatever. I'm going to dig myself a hole. I really like knowing Julia in the way I know Julia. It's great. And I also think of Julia first and foremost as a sociologist, and I am a sociologist, and so I feel I'm very interested in her work, and it's very exciting for me that a biography like hers is also a biography where a woman can be known through her published works. You know, that's a great historical achievement, and so you know that's in a sense one of the expressions of being the generation that Julia is. So what I'm going to talk about draws on the paper that I contributed to the special issue, which very much is about engaging with Julia's work and engaging with her as a sociologist and trying to think about her as a sociologist and think with her as a sociologist. So you don't have to read the paper. This is the paper through Wordle. So there you go. They've got the broad outline of what it is, but it kind of gives you a sense, a sort of a condensed a legend to go into the themes. I think what I'm going to do, I'll just tell you a bit about how it came about, and then I'm going to read a bit and then skate through another bit. But I suppose I'll just explain how I came to write what I wrote when I got this invitation. Julia was part of a group of people who were part of a seminar, I think it was in something like 2005, that we held at South Bank about researching social change, qualitative approaches, where we brought together lots of examples of the different kinds of work that people have been doing, trying to think about social change empirically using qualitative methods, which resulted in a book that Julie MacLeod and I published in 2009 called Researching Social Change, where we divided the book into three sort of temporal regimes or timescapes really. One which was looking at the past under the title Remembering, one which was called Being With, which was about the present tense, which we looked at ethnography and longitudinal qualitative research, and one which was the most difficult one really to conceptualize, which we called Inheritance, where we located intergenerational work and secondary analysis of archived data. And it was in the, we could put a piece of Julia's work into every bit of that book, but it was in the chapter on generational work where I really spent quite a lot of time thinking with Julia, looking at the wonderful book that she and colleagues wrote here, the Working and Caring Over the 20th Century, looking at four-generation families. So that was, to me, I spent a lot, I think if anyone, there's a wonderful thing about actually writing and publishing something is it remains in the world and can be read again at different points. One thing about Julia's writing is that it is so rich and dense, you can go back and back and back to it. There's a lot there, there's a lot more than it seems to be, and it really bears interrogation, which I think is probably the result of what you were talking about, Anne, in terms of the complexity and the subtlety of her thinking and the rigour of the work that goes into it, into any analysis. So I had this book in my head, and then last year or the year before I read Mike Savage's book about the history of sociology, which is name always escapes me because it's a really not very exciting title. It's something about social identities and something. But to me, it's a really provocative, interesting book because it takes a historical lens on sociology and asks us, what is sociology? How does it work? How does its methods create a world, a kind of approach to the world and form of knowledge? And when did it happen and why did it happen in the way that it did? And I found that very, very interesting and provoking book to read. And then the third bit of the puzzle was I was asked by Oral History to review a book, which is the second of these, Modern Motherhood, book by Angela Davis, which actually covers the same time period pretty much as the working caring of the 20th century, but from a historical perspective. And it got me really thinking about what's the difference between a historical approach and a sociological approach, and what's the relationship, where are the boundaries, what matters and why does it matter? And that's what I've ended up writing about in the paper. So just in terms of setting the scene, I don't know if people are sort of familiar. I'll give a very shortcut version of Mike Savage's argument, which is he argues that the sort of post-war period saw the rise of a different kind of sociology than had been there in the early days of sociology, particularly in sort of departments like the LSE, for example, which he characterises as a gentlemanly sociology, which was closely a syncretic discipline, closely related and bringing together insights from geography, from a whole range of disciplines which were very engaged with actual landscapes, which were quite moral and moralistic, drew heavily on social policy, on social work reports of families, heavy use of secondary sources, and was very normative and very much engaged with how the world should be, how to improve the world. And he tells an interesting story about the sort of invention of a modern sociology, which was very different than that. And central to the argument was both the introduction or the sort of invention of the survey, which could abstract, and the sample, the representative sample that could abstract from this landscape the notions of the generalisable and the national picture, but also the interview, the qualitative interview was the sort of second part of this of this kind of creation of modern sociology. And he characterises it in a number of ways, that it takes nothing for granted. We have no assumptions of what should be, how things should be. It refuses conventional normative framing, respects the everyday and the ordinary, and also engages in a form of abstraction where sources or the world becomes data in some kind of way and is bracketed off, and we work with the data and we separate the data from the context. And has many rigorous approaches to analysis and complicated ways of getting from the specific to the generalisable. And alongside this is a rise in an interest in ethics. And perhaps the most controversial element of his argument is a sort of suspicion of those ethics, that in a sense, perhaps those ethics are covering something up, and they're not simply, they demand explanation in some other ways. So I think this is very interesting, not only an interesting story and one that has been critiqued and contested and is critiqued and contested, but it's interesting that it's being told now at this historical moment. And Savage kind of says that that's partly to do with the impact of digitisation, that this version of sociology and the authority of this version of sociology is in trouble, in that we don't need samples in the same way because we have real-time data. So this kind of moment when the abstracted, generalisable sample and the data set meant this, it has moved. So we now we're in a different historical moment, and we are able to see perhaps sociology in this way. So whether you agree with it or not, it's really, really provocative and interesting as a sociologist to have to think about. And in a sense, he's bringing a historical lens onto our own discipline to ask us to do that. So, yeah, one of the things I've tried to do in the paper is think about these two pieces of work, both of which are absolutely fantastic books, and interestingly come to similar conclusions, actually analytic conclusions about the period, which I think is fascinating in very different ways. So, just to say a little bit, this really is like telling Julia what she did. I'm trying not to say that at all. I suppose I'm trying to think about how does sociology approach this conundrum? How does sociology try to think about researching social change? And Anne said something about the distinction between cohorts and intergenerational chains that is part of the sociological sort of toolkit. And it's interestingly in this study the way in which the intergenerational chain. So by that I mean the sort of whether it's the daughter, mother, and grandmother, great grandmother. That as opposed to saying the baby boomers, the generation X. So think about chains as being the line that connects people over time. That it's the chains that the researchers start with, and that's the empirical starting point for the project. But they're incredibly carefully chosen chains. The notion that, and I think this is one of the really interesting things about the study, is the way in which sampling is involved, and sampling is central to the project, so that the chains allow an anchoring of the empirical in a way that some kind of comparison and conversation between the different case studies, if we think of a chain as a case study, is possible, both in time and in social space. And the selection of the chains is very much done to make comparison possible. And one of the really interesting insights, both in this book but in other methodological writing that Anne and Julia have done subsequently, is about how, in order to be able to make generalizations or talk about diversity, you may have to start with homogeneity. So the similarity between the cases is absolutely critical in order to get your first foot on the ladder that might allow you then to make some generalizations or to think about complexity or introduce complexity into the picture. So, in a sense, you need some kind of simplicity in order to be able to take on complexity in a way that does it justice. Interesting, really interesting, and I think that perhaps this again goes back to what Anne was saying, that this is a real feature or signature of Julia's work, is this kind of tension between realism and it's hard to say, interpretivism. Wanting to have your cake and eat it, I think, would be another very justified approach to life. A ambition to speak to the real, and not only to speak to it, but to recognise it, to recognise the real in terms of real problems, real suffering, real capacity to influence policy and practice, but also no sense of, no simplicity about how that's made, and always not treating things at face value. So always knowing that that people will say what it's possible to say in any situation, as opposed to what might be true, without giving up the notion that there could be some truth. And that in terms of this study, but I would say probably across the board, is a real feature, a signature of Julia's work. But also this really clever use of comparison in research design. And I tried to think, why is it I really like Julia's work? I think it's because you're a great designer, that you're interested in designing things into the study so that the structure does some of the work for you. It's not all about interpretation. Actually, the structure carries a lot. So using comparison all the way through the structure and scaling up, finding smart ways of scaling up from the case to the social and to the historical. And I don't know whether, yes, I have got it here. when I have this as an admission, Julia. When I first read this book, I was really disappointed with these models. I was like, oh, is that all it boils down to? Is that how, is that it? And I know you also say this about them. They seem static. They seem sort of, in a sense, disappointing. But there's so much in these. It takes, if you really start working and thinking about what Julia manages, or Julia and her colleagues, of course, because that's always how it is, but manages to bring into models like this, it's extraordinary. So, for instance, the one on my left, so you're also your left, that's really interesting. So here we have, in a sense, the whole book, actually, isn't it? It's the whole study boiled down to an image. So at the bottom, we have innovation. At the top, we have, I think you're actually really, you don't even say sort of static or continuity. But so this is about social mobility. What's the relationship between geographical mobility and social mobility? Huge question. And in this picture, you both theorise it, but also you put real cases in there. People who are living in that space, whose lives are infused by that logic of practice, whose biographical questions are shaped by that social space. And the fact is that that social space is relational as well as absolute. So the fact that there are, I think there's another one here on the right, which is about fatherhood. A similar kind of approach to thinking about the relationship between involvement and family structure. But fascinatingly, there are certain squares, quadrants, where there's no one in them. They're such difficult places to be that there's no one in them. But you might keep researching and find some few people in them, but they'll probably find it very hard to survive in them. So these have, this show all that labour of scaling up from the small, ambiguous story to the big social structure is there in these very elegant diagrams. Okay. And so those are the relational analytic typologies. And as I was just saying, psychological depth, internal coherence, and in a social and relational field. It looks straightforward when you see the model, but it's really extraordinarily sophisticated and admirable work. And one of the things this is the riddle I've been working on, was where is place in this? Because one of the things that I was very interested in is the sampling approach in this study refuses to deal with place. So place is not there in terms of the selection of people. People are selected by time, their age, and social class, and a purposive sample built in that way, but not through place. Yet in the case studies, it's all about place. So it's just very interesting thinking, we might think, oh, you have to build place into sampling, perhaps not. But if you don't, doesn't mean you're losing it. You might get it elsewhere. And if you come to compare it with this other study, it's really fascinating because that's not how the historical approach works. And if we're thinking about what's sociological about this approach, that's one of the things that makes it sociological. So these are just a few little bullet points in terms of, because I kind of engaged with not quite such a deep analysis, but quite a sort of engaged analysis with the Angela Davis book. And fascinatingly, that starts with place. So it's based on the new empirical material for that is 116 oral histories of women in the Oxfordshire area, but it samples them in relation as cohorts. And does interviews, life history interviews, so looking back to, and so there aren't chains, they're individual interviews, forwards and back. And then it goes from these interviews and starts linking in all these other data sets. So these might be documents, they might be local history, studies of also, official data, official statistics, but also other social science studies related to the locality. And then it starts linking in other social science studies that aren't related to the locality at all. So, takes data from the mass observation, links in with accounts from studies in Liverpool. As a sociologist, you really think, you can't do that. You can't do that. You have to have some boundaries. So what we see is starting with place and a very coherent sense of place, and then an assemblage of all these heterogeneous sources of evidence linked together. in a really radically different approach. As I said, what's interesting is some very similar conclusions came from the two studies around the importance or the centrality of the term ambivalence. Okay. So I suppose what I was doing in this paper was thinking with Julia, and I think this is one of the nice things about if you publish, if you have the privilege to publish, you can be thought with, which is an extraordinary thing, and you can be thought with without knowing that someone's thinking with you, so it's not embarrassing. So unless you have to have an event like this. So, so in terms of what does it mean thinking with Julia's work? I mean, one of the I suppose there's this real sense of there is a signature focus and style, and Anne, in the paper that Anne has written in the journal, she really goes into that, thinking what's Julia's signature, and I think that's really, and it's not just about topics, it's also about style and the way she does that, and you know that's not surprising. That's how we are, and it's very interesting and very striking. And I think, as you say, strangely enough, contract research provided an environment for that to be possible. I mean, if I try to think about some of the words that it includes, I think dynamic, not necessarily in terms of woo, dynamic, but more dynamic. So, yeah, theoretically dynamic, that Juliet's interested in movement, and she designs movement into her sort of four-dimensional research designed projects in a really interesting way. Very analytic, always theorised, but also there's this process of accountability, allowing somebody else to see what you've done. Now, what I was able to do with that book was to think about how Julia had done it. Most people do not write up their research in a way that you'd ever know what they did in a real way. So that accountability is in itself the production of knowledge. Subtlety is a real, that's probably a word that needs unpacking, I think, but I think it's a very suitable word. Innovative, and probably the intelligent design, I think would be it's the right one. But it's interesting coming back to Mike Savage's, sort of terms about sociology as well. I think in some ways, although I think not for the reasons that he might argue, these terms really work for Julia's work. The idea of taking nothing for granted, refusing conventional normative framings, and respecting the everyday and the ordinary. In that respect, she's a consummate sociologist, but I don't think it comes actually from sociology. I think it comes from this alternative tradition of feminist, socialist, committed, applied scholarship that was often done in highly precarious circumstances, exactly what Anne's talked about, those epistemic communities that were possible during this time period. So I would kind of want to conclude with arguing back against Mike Savage, not just, it's the wrong account, but whose turn to time are we talking about? Because I think a lot of the labour that was done in the turn to time that's now kind of described, and he's very much involved in describing, is not necessarily the product of sociology, but is of these other less named and perhaps more marginal traditions.